Hi, everybody. Welcome to this online Marxist forum on Marxist theory of history. So we've got Morgan Daniels, who is an activist, a historian, and a long-time member of Counterfire. So he's going to talk for about sort of 25 minutes, something like that, and then we'll have time for discussion. So over to you, Morgan.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and everyone for being here on this gorgeous and incredibly hot evening. Um, is everyone able to hear me? Okay, I'm at some distance from my computer right now. Is the volume okay? Okay, cool. Um, in terms of thinking about a Marxist theory of history, there is a need to start with what Marx and Engels saw as the one sort of unchanging aspect of human history, of human existence. And to talk about an unchanging aspect of humanity in Marx's view is no small thing, because Marx and Engels were firm believers in flux, in the fact that things change and are constantly changing. Marx famously wrote that all that is solid melts into air. So for Marx to see something as fixed and unchanging is a very big deal. And that thing, I guess simply put, is survival. That across all human societies, what is unchanging is the fact that we need to do labor, which allows for us to survive, and allows for the next generation to survive, allows for the human species to continue on. We need to eat food, drink water, have shelter, make clothes, and we need to make sure that our children have the same thing. Um, if I can begin with a bit of a quotation from Marx. Marx wrote in the 1840s in a work called The German Ideology, the first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men, apologies for the gendered nature of this, are indirectly producing their actual material life. So we're beginning with the work, the labor performed that is necessary for the production and reproduction of our species. And there are three things to say really about this work. The first is that it is work on nature. It is work on the world around us. Um, that is the crux of the matter. We perform labor on nature in order to get the materials, get the things that we need to survive. The second thing to say about this labor is that it is conscious. It is imaginative. It's you might say, in a famous bit in Capital, Karl Marx wrote about bees, and he wrote about the miraculous things that you find in nature, like spiders' webs and so on. But he made a very important distinction. He said, "What distinguishes the best of bees from the worst of human architects is that the human architect imagines the end product of their labor in his or her mind's eye before commencing that work. Whereas the spider or the bee makes these incredible things on a kind of evolutionary instinct, right? That this is not conscious labor, it's kind of instinctive, evolutionarily informed work. The third thing to say about this labor is that it's collective, that there is no magical, mythical, individual Superman who can live in complete isolation, right? That the work that we do in order to survive is a collective work. Even the Unabomber occasionally got on his bike and cycled into Lincoln, Montana, in order to use the payphone and buy some groceries, right? Uh, if you live in the middle of nowhere in some house and grow all your own food and you have a self-sufficient life, well, probably you are still living in a house that other people have made. And even if you do make your own tools to cut down trees, to build your own home, in the garden of which is an entirely self-sufficient array of fruit and vegetables. Well, even then, that imagined individual has learned how to be a member of society by being in society. That person has learned how to make things, how to speak, how to think, and so forth, as part of a collective process. So this is collective labor that we are dealing with. Now, at this point, we seem like we're a long way away from revolution. We're a long way away from the revolutionary ideas that Karl Marx is associated with. What does this insight about the unchanging nature, the unchanging aspect, this particular unchanging aspect of human society, what does that tell us about social change? What does it tell us about how we go from one epoch to another? What does it tell us about how revolutions occur? The first point here is that this uh, conscious collective labor on the world around us changes ourselves and changes the society around us. You know, at a micro level, Engels makes this point that when our forebears began to make tools with which to work on the land, this was not just us working on nature, but nature working on us. When we developed primitive tools, we evolved the necessary shape of hand in order to hold those tools and make them work better. But at a kind of macro level, there is another thing going on, and succinctly put by Marx, this is that, and I quote, social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. Social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. What does that mean? The first thing to define is this question of forces of production or productive forces. And by this, Marx did not simply mean the technology available in any given society, in any given epoch. He also meant the labor power and the types of labor available in that society. Technology is useless if it is not employed by labor. So broadly speaking, when we talk about productive forces, we're talking about the things at a society's disposal to make stuff, to survive, the productive capacity, the technology, the labor. This other term that needs defining, social relations, kind of means most everything else. It means the relations we have with one another. It means the ways in which we live. It means the ideas that circulate in the society. It means the sort of institutions, the sort of politics, and so on that you find in a given society. And I mean, let's just, take an example of this. If we go back to hunter-gatherer societies, we find in the first instance forms of society which hunt, which gather, but which do so essentially to survive. The work that is performed, the labor that is performed by these societies is basically enough to survive. There is no surplus. With the change in techniques, with the development of these societies, you find that a surplus does emerge. That there is the creation of more food, more various things than is immediately required. And as soon as you have surplus, as soon as hunter-gatherer societies develop a surplus, well, then that changes potentially a lot. It creates the potential for people to sit around and do nothing and hoard that wealth, whilst others do the work. It creates the potential for all sorts of hierarchical societies. It creates the potential for class society. It also makes conflict, makes war more likely. Um, but I'll quote Marx again on this very point, and then expand on it if I may. Marx put it like this. Um, Marx put it like this, and this is from 1859. So this is 8 years before he wrote Capital. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which corresponds definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. And it's in this context that a very famous line of Marx rests. Quote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." Now, this relationship between um, social relations and productive forces is, often characterized in terms of base and superstructure. You have an economic base in the productive forces, and the superstructure meaning everything that flows from that. And I guess it would be useful just for a minute to think about some concrete ways in which this happens, right? Let us just think of two very intimately related examples, meaning racism and the police. A static interpretation of human history and of human nature would maybe suggest that racism is something built into our DNA that is unchanging, that in any given epoch you can find prejudice and discrimination. This is just who humans are. We are inherently this or inherently that. But I guess the point is that racism, like everything else, has a history. And if we think about a very modern form of racism, the racism against black people, that has a very particular history. When the African slaving system was kind of codified and expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries by European powers. The start point of that, was not an idea. The idea, there wasn't a start point whereby a bunch of merchants thought that it would be a good idea just for fun to ship enslaved Africans over the Atlantic for centuries. This was not the start point of the slave trade. The start point of the slave trade was an economic necessity for merchants and for the plantation owners and so on. They found in African labor a cheap source of labor to exploit, and from there was the need to develop very recognizable modern forms of racism expressing ideas about black people which made them inferior, which exaggerated this or that about Africans and made them less than human. So racism was a necessary product of the transatlantic slave trade. It was necessary to create a system of racism that made acceptable, that justified shipping more than 12 million Africans over the Atlantic to places like New England or Jamaica. And yeah, this form of racism is enmeshed within the system, is baked into the capitalist system, as evidenced by the routine murder of black people by cops in the US. On the subject of the police, this is again something that arose as a historical necessity in a given shifting moment of productive forces. It is not a random thing. it is not a coincidence that what is recognizable as the first modern professional police force, the London Met, was established in 1829 in London. London in 1829 was the capital of the most advanced capitalist nation in the world, a capital of an empire, and was a city of ever escalating scale, a city which had grown in size on account of mass immigration from the countryside, from Ireland, from elsewhere, in search of work. In this context, you have a very volatile and antagonistic situation indeed. You have tens of thousands, then hundreds, then millions of working class people living in the same areas, working in the same factories, sharing a common oppression, sharing a common exploitation. And these people are living very often cheek by jowl with, or very close to, the newly minted propertied classes who are creaming off the profits, the still very young capitalist class. In that context, you have an irresolvable class antagonism. In that context, with the mass production of commodities through the harnessing of steam power and so on, in that context, it became necessary for the status quo to develop a police force that could protect property and protect that status quo. So again, this is another example of the way in which the superstructure flows from the economic base. But what's very, very important here is that this is not a deterministic relationship. Marx was not saying, as many of his detractors would have it, that changes in technology simply mechanically change ideas in the society. For one thing, as I mentioned previously, Marx was very clear that the productive forces were not simply bits of technology, but also labor itself. But secondly, it's very important to hit back against this argument. An enthusiasm for, an optimism in new forms of technology, it has been, a major thing of the past 30, 40 years. In the early days of the internet, many people put their chips on the internet as being a grand leveler, that it would transform us into some sort of grand global village of equality. We don't need to name names to think about the sort of people who expounded this idea of technological determinism and optimism. But among the many, many problems with this analysis, if you can call it an analysis, is that if technology changes everything, and what room is there even in that context for activism? If something like the internet is our salvation, well, we don't need to bother being on the streets. We don't bother needing to commit our lives to changing the world. We just need Tim Berners-Lee to come along and write some code. So it's a very disempowering way of looking at the world, and it's certainly not the way in which Marx looked at the world. I'd like to read one of Marx's most famous passages, which very much cuts to the key issue here. Marx said, and again it's men, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So here we have the dynamic approach to the world that characterizes Marxism. We make our own history, but not in circumstances of our own choosing. Here Marx is saying, crucially, that we have agency, to use a very fashionable term. We have the capacity to make our own history, but this does not exist in a vacuum. We are doing so in specific historical conditions and circumstances. And I'll begin to wrap up on a couple of last points around this, because for me this is so essential for us as activists going, thinking about the 21st century. Because all of this leads to the question of social change and how it happens. We make our own history, but not in circumstances of our own choosing. Um, Not in circumstances of our own choosing. Um, we have independent thoughts about other types of society. We have independent thoughts about what the world might otherwise look like. But really, the critical question here is, can those ideas be translated into reality within a given set of historical circumstances? Can those ideas become reality given the balance of productive forces? So let me just again read one final sort of longish quotation, and I'll try and sort of unpick that and draw some conclusions. Um, this again is from 1859. Marx wrote, "At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or," and he says this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, "with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution." So what Marx is getting at here is that at certain times in history, there is a slippage between the productive forces and the social relations. A very good example of this would be the English Revolution of the 1640s. There you had a burgeoning capitalist class which saw in the absolutism of King Charles I a bulwark against the expansion of capitalism. And of course, capitalism sure as hell needs to expand. So, in the English Revolution, you have that kind of conflict. So this is kind of how Marxists see these revolutionary moments at times in which the kind of productive forces are speeding ahead of the norms and ideas of a given society. But this is not an inevitability. There were no inevitabilities with Marx apart from the need to eat, sleep, and shelter. What is inevitable is that these crises will happen. What is inevitable is that there are contradictions again and again in any given society. What is not inevitable is how those contradictions, how those crises will be resolved. And that really points us to the last point I want to make. Because, as I say, the important thing is not ideas. Ideas don't change society. People change society. People change the world. What matters is whether or not, ideas can be manifest in a given historical situation. And I guess the point is that ideas look different in different historical circumstances. Somebody I'm very fond of, and I know some people on this call are fond of too, was a 14th century preacher by the name of John Ball, who was one of the leading figures of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which tens of thousands of peasants descended upon London in protest at a unfair poll tax. And John Ball was a radical preacher who found in scripture justification, I guess, for a kind of proto-communism. One of Ball's most notable, evocative and provocative sayings was that he said, "My good friends, things cannot go well in England, nor ever will, until everything shall be in common, where there shall be neither vassal nor lord, and all distinctions levelled." Now, these are words I think we all believe in. I certainly do. These are beautiful, empowering, and correct words. But a leveled society in John Ball's time would have looked very different to one in the 21st century. The productive forces in 1381 would not have been such that a leveled society would have afforded mass wealth to everyone in that society. Our society is different. One of the great contradictions of capitalism is that it has demonstrated very clearly and inarguably the amazing productive capacity of human beings. You only have to look at any city or any way you so choose to see that productive capacity in full motion. It has shown, yeah, that productive capacity writ large. But at the same time, it has also created a world historic phenomenon that does not exist in previous societies. It has created a vast working class of people, who have tremendous potential power to transform their own lives. This is kind of what Marx is getting at with people making their own destiny, but making their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. This returns us right to the very beginning of Marx's thinking about history. Marx and Engels were insistent that collective, imaginative, conscious labor on the world was the final say in terms of the human species. This is how we have made and remade the world, remade our lives. It is true today in terms of transforming our society in the direction of socialism. If you think about it, collective conscious labor on the world is very much what political activism is too. So, we live in a society in which there are contradictions aplenty, crises abound. The capacity for us to turn that into socialism rests very much in our ability to organize collectively to transform our society. We can't sit around, twiddle our thumbs, and wait for Tim Berners-Lee. So this is it. A Marxist theory of history is not simply a theoretical thing, is not simply an amusing way of looking at the past, but really also is a field guide to the present. It's a reminder that we can indeed collectively change the world, even if it is not within circumstances of our own choosing. Thank you very much.